The room I keep coming back to is not the room where it happened. It is the room just before it. A narrow corridor off the main wing of the monastery, stone floor, single electric bulb overhead, a small wooden bench against the wall where postulants would sit before formation meetings. I was 20 years old. It was February, cold enough that you could see your breath even indoors. My veil was freshly pressed. My hands were folded the way we had been taught to fold them, quietly, in the lap, as though stillness in the body could manufacture stillness in the mind. I had been told the night before by Sister Bernadette, the formation director, a woman I respected with the particular completeness that comes from having no other frame of reference, that the following morning something would happen that was described to me as a premarital assessment. Those were her words. A premarital assessment. I did not know what that meant, I asked. She said it was a formality. She said it was conducted out of care. She said I would understand better when I was older. I was about to be handed to a man I had met twice at family-approved gatherings. In my community, brides did not choose. Brides were chosen, and before a man could bring a woman before the priest, before any of the arrangements could be finalized, he was permitted. Permitted by the community, by custom, by the quiet architecture of expectation that nobody ever wrote down, but everyone enforced, to inspect her. That word, inspect. I did not understand the full weight of it until I was sitting in a therapist's office at 28 years old, 8 years after it happened, finally using language I had never been allowed to reach for before. My name is Sister Cecilia, though I have not gone by that name in 4 years. This channel is where I tell the truth about what religious life in certain communities actually looks like from the inside. Not the version in the pamphlets. Not the version that gets quoted in documentaries about tradition and faith, and the beauty of consecrated living. The actual version. The one that lives in stone corridors and folded hands and sentences that end before they reach the part you needed to hear. If you are new here, please subscribe, please like this video. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from, because I read every single one, and knowing you are out there matters more to me than I can properly explain. What I want to tell you today is not only my story. It is the story of a practice that exists in communities most people on the outside have never encountered, described in language so careful and so deliberately vague that the women inside those communities rarely find words for it until long after they have left. There are 3 layers to what I'm going to share: the practice itself, what it did to me, and what I eventually understood about why it existed at all. The first layer is the practice. In the religious community where I was raised, marriage was not a private decision. Marriage was a communal one. It was brokered between families, blessed by the clergy, and governed by a set of expectations so deeply embedded in daily life that questioning them felt less like disagreement and more like asking gravity to explain itself. Men in our community who were preparing to marry were given what the older women called, in the quiet language they used for anything uncomfortable, a time of confirmation, a chance to verify. The framing was always pastoral, always gentle, always wrapped in the language of care and prudence and proper preparation. What it actually meant was this: before the engagement was formally announced, before the priest was involved, before any of the public ceremonies began, the prospective husband was granted one, and sometimes 2, occasions to assess his intended bride in the presence of a senior woman from the community, an older sister who served, without any formal title, as a kind of arbiter, a keeper of standards. A woman whose job was to stand in the room and ensure that what was being examined was examined correctly. My mother told me this would happen the week before it did. She sat on the edge of my bed and she spoke to me in the tone she reserved for information she was not comfortable delivering, but felt duty-bound to pass along. Briefly, practically, the way you tell a child something difficult by compressing it into the smallest possible shape so it takes up the least possible room. She said that Brother Damien's family had requested a confirmation before proceeding. She said Sister Agatha would be present. She said it would be conducted respectfully and that I should cooperate fully, and that this was simply how these things were done in families like ours. I asked what it would involve. She looked at the window. She said, "He will want to see that you are well." That was all. I was 20 years old. I had been raised my entire life to understand that a woman's role in the structure of our community was defined primarily by her utility to it, her health, her capacity for work, her ability to carry children and manage a household and present herself as an extension of her husband's standing. I had never been taught to question this. I had never been offered an alternative framework, and so when my mother told me that a man I barely knew would be brought into a room to confirm that I met the necessary criteria for marriage, what I felt was not outrage. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. Something with no edges. Something that I now understand was the particular sensation of a person who has been told that their body is a category of information rather than a home. The first assessment happened on a Thursday evening. My father and brothers had been asked to help with something outdoors, the way men in our community were always conveniently occupied when women's business was being conducted. Sister Agatha arrived first. She was a woman somewhere in her 60s with a face like a decision that had already been made, steady, closed, certain. She arranged herself near the window with her hands in her lap and waited. Damien came in shortly after. He was 24, he was considered, by the standards of our community, an excellent prospect. Devout, responsible, from a family with standing. He had a directness about him that the older members admired, and that I had always found slightly unnerving in the way that directness unnerves you when it is pointed at something other than you. That evening, it was pointed directly at me. He did not look at me the way I had seen men look at women. They were courting in the narrow, sanctioned ways our community permitted courtship. He looked at me with a kind of clinical attention that I had no context for. His eyes moved in the systematic way of someone performing a task, not the uncertain way of someone feeling something. Sister Agatha directed the encounter from her chair. She asked me to stand. She asked me to turn. She asked me to extend my hands, palms upward. He asked questions about my health history. About whether certain conditions ran in my family. Whether I had ever had prolonged illness. Whether I slept well. Whether I ate consistently. My mother, who had been permitted to stay, answered most of them. I stood with my palms out and I listened to my own health being discussed in the third person, as though I were a report being reviewed rather than a person being addressed. Sister Agatha offered her assessment in the calm, authoritative tone of someone issuing a certification. She spoke about my constitution, about my frame, about her confidence in my capacity for the work of household and family. She did not ask me a single question about what I hoped for, about what I feared, about whether there was anything in the arrangement that I found difficult or confusing or wrong. Damien thanked Sister Agatha. He thanked my mother. He nodded at me in the brisk, cordial way you nod at something you have confirmed to your satisfaction. And then he left. Sister Agatha gathered herself and departed shortly after. My mother disappeared into the kitchen. And I stood alone in that room for a moment with my hands still slightly raised, palms up, and then I slowly lowered them. I went upstairs. I straightened things that did not need straightening. I made a bed that was already made, and I did not yet have language for why I needed so urgently to do something with my hands. The second assessment happened 8 days later. My mother told me the night before, in the same tone, in the same sitting on the edge of the bed posture. She said Damien had some additional questions. She said Sister Agatha had suggested a follow-up given the thoroughness of the arrangement. She said it would be shorter. I will not describe the second assessment in its full detail, because the platform I'm speaking on has boundaries, and I have spent enough years working within the limits of structures that tell me how much I am allowed to say that I have become, perhaps involuntarily, very good at identifying exactly where those lines are. What I will tell you is this. After it was over, Sister Agatha said something to my mother in a low voice that I was not intended to hear, but did, because I was 3 feet away and I had been trained since childhood to make myself so quiet and so still that people regularly forgot I was present. She said, "She will serve him well." 5 words. She will serve him well. Not she is a remarkable young woman. Not she has a good mind and a strong will and she is going to need a great deal more than this. Just, she will serve him well. As though the only relevant question had been asked and answered and the evaluation was complete. I want to tell you about another woman. I will call her Marguerite. I met Marguerite at a small gathering years after we had both left our respective communities. Different orders, different regions, different theological frameworks, but something in the way she held herself when she entered a room told me before she said a word that we had navigated similar architecture. The particular posture of a woman who has spent years learning to make herself readable to others while keeping her own interior life carefully out of view. Marguerite had been assessed 3 times. She said this matter-of-factly, 3 times. Her intended's family had raised what they called a concern after the second visit, and a third had been requested to address it. She never learned what the concern was. She was simply summoned and presented and evaluated, and then told the concern had been resolved, and the arrangement would proceed. She was 17 for the first 2. 18 for the third. We sat with that for a moment, not performing composure, actually needing it. She told me that for years afterward she could not be in a room where someone looked at her too directly without her body responding with a low generalized alarm that she couldn't trace to anything specific. She said she had only recently in therapy understood where it lived. She said the therapist had called it a somatic response to a specific experience of objectification, and that the clinical language had been both helpful and insufficient, because some things are too dense to fit inside a phrase without losing something essential in the compression. I knew exactly what she meant. I want to be careful here, because the practice I'm describing is not universal. It does not exist in every religious community or every traditionally conservative family structure. There is enormous variation in how these communities operate, and I am not describing a monolith, but I am also not describing a rarity. In the more conservative formations, in certain orders and affiliated lay communities where the structures of religious hierarchy extend into the organization of family life and marriage, practices like the one I experienced exist, the way many things exist in those environments. Not in writing, not in any document you could request or any policy you could cite, but in the understanding, in the expectation, in the way older women speak to younger ones in brief practical tones about things that are coming, in the way compliance is prepared rather than chosen. The Ordnung, as certain communities call it, the code that governs behavior without ever being committed to paper, does not need to be defended. It only needs to be maintained, and it is maintained the same way it has always been maintained. Through repetition, through silence, through the steady transmission of difficult information from one generation to the next in voices too low to be questioned and tones too authoritative to be refused. I married Damien. The ceremony was in early spring. Long, formal, deeply theological. The priest spoke about submission in the specific language that those communities use for submission, which sounds if you have grown up inside it, like love, and sounds, if you have spent enough time outside it, like something else entirely. I stood in my formal dress and I listened, and somewhere underneath the listening I was thinking about my palms held out in the sitting room, about Sister Agatha's voice, about my mother's profile against the window light when I asked what the assessment would involve and she looked away before she answered. I thought, the submission did not begin here, it began long before the vows. It began the first time I was told what was coming and asked to cooperate fully, and offered nothing in return except the information that this was simply how things were done. Our marriage lasted 5 years. Damien was not a man who understood himself to have done anything wrong. He had been given a framework by his community, and the framework told him that what he had done was careful and responsible. That a man who proceeds with prudence, who confirms before committing, who involves appropriate oversight, is a man who takes his responsibilities seriously. His community handed him that understanding with complete sincerity. Mine handed me my silence with the same sincerity. And neither of us, standing in that assessment room with Sister Agatha between us and my palms held upward, had been given the tools to see what was actually happening. That is the thing I have spent the most time with. Not anger at him as a person, though that came and went in the years immediately after I left, but something wider and colder than personal anger. Anger at a system that produced 2 people and handed one of them permission he didn't know to question, and the other one a silence she didn't know she was allowed to break, and then stood back and called the result a holy covenant. After I left, the community's response was swift and quiet. The particular silence of people who have decided you no longer exist in the ways that count. The unreturned messages. The family members who spoke to me in careful, abbreviated sentences that contained information but no warmth. My mother once, staying on the line just long enough to say she was praying for me before the line went dead. I have thought about that click many times. The precise sound of a door closing from the inside. In therapy, I was given language I had never been permitted to hold before. The therapist was a woman who had worked for years with people leaving high-control religious environments. She had heard many things. She did not offer shock easily. When I described both assessments in full, the room, the positioning, Sister Agatha, my mother's averted eyes, Damien's clinical attention, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me a question that I have carried with me since. She said, at any point during either of those assessments, did anyone ask how you felt? I sat with it. I went back through both rooms, both evenings, every exchange I could recall. My mother, Sister Agatha, Damien, my father afterward in the kitchen. No, I said. No one asked, she said. That is not an oversight. That is the design. She meant that the absence of my experience was not accidental, not a matter of everyone being too busy or too distracted to include me in the conversation about my own body. She meant that my interior experience of the assessment was structurally irrelevant to its purpose. What mattered was the assessor's conclusion, the confirming elder's certification, the family's satisfaction, the arrangement's continuation. My feelings were not data anyone was collecting. My feelings had never been the point. I think often about a girl I noticed once at a community gathering when I was 19, the year before my own assessments. She was standing slightly apart from the main group, near the edge of the courtyard, watching the people around her with an expression I did not have the vocabulary for at the time. I have the vocabulary now. She looked like someone who had just discovered that the building she was living in had load-bearing walls she had never been told about. That the structure she had been navigating her whole life had hidden architecture that shaped everything she did without her consent or knowledge. I know that expression from the inside. I wore it for several years without knowing what it was. If you grew up in a community where your body was presented for evaluation before anyone thought to ask what you experienced, I want to say something directly to you. You were not an object. You were never an object. The fact that you were treated as a category of information, as a set of criteria to be assessed against, as a field to be evaluated for fertility and capacity and suitability, does not make that treatment accurate. It makes it wrong. It makes it something that should have been named and refused by every adult in every room where it occurred. You were not wrong for complying. You were given a framework and you operated within it, because that is what you had been prepared to do, from childhood, with complete consistency, by people who were themselves operating within the same framework, without ever having been offered a way out of it. The mistake was not yours. The mistake was the framework. You were allowed to have feelings in that room. You were allowed to find it wrong. You were allowed to say something, even if the words hadn't been given to you yet. You were allowed to be a full person in a system that was very carefully designed to require you to be something less than that. Your body was never a report to be reviewed. It was always yours. It is still yours. And the silence you were handed and told was modesty. The compliance you were trained into and told was virtue. The endurance you performed and called faithfulness. None of that was a spiritual gift you were giving. It was something being taken from you by a structure that needed your silence to hold itself together. The silence was not sacred. It was architectural, it was load-bearing. And it has been passed down through the hands of women who accepted it, because they were handed it by women who accepted it before them, all the way back through generations of girls standing in rooms with their palms out, and no one in the room asking the only question that actually mattered. How are you? What do you need? Are you all right in the way that means something beyond still breathing? There is a version of this story I cannot fully tell on this platform. The assessment rooms have details that the space I am speaking in does not permit. I wrote those details down instead, slowly and without softening, in a document that lives somewhere the algorithm cannot reach. If you want to find the complete account, it is in the first comment below this video. Everything I could not say out loud is there. If this story landed somewhere real in you, tell me in the comments. Tell me what part stayed. Tell me your own version if you are ready to speak it, or even if you're only ready to begin reaching for the words. I read every single comment. I will read yours. Subscribe to this channel. There's still so much that has not been said out loud. Until next time, your body was never a question someone else got to answer. It was always the answer. Even when they handed you to a room and called the silence around you modesty, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.